In the bitter winter of 1916, amidst the mechanical slaughter of the First World War, a quieter, far more insidious terror emerged in the hospitals of Vienna. Soldiers and civilians alike began to exhibit a bizarre symptom, characterized by an overwhelming, inescapable urge to sleep. This was not the restorative slumber of the exhausted, but a profound, unnatural lethargy where victims could be roused only briefly before slipping back into a comatose state. Some remained conscious but entirely immobilized, trapped as silent observers within the unyielding prisons of their own bodies. The terrifying reality of being locked inside a motionless frame, aware but unable to interact with the world, marked the beginning of one of the most baffling medical anomalies of the modern era. The Austrian neurologist Konstantin von Economo was the first to formalize this harrowing condition, naming it encephalitis lethargica, an inflammation of the brain causing profound drowsiness. As the Great War raged, the affliction silently crossed borders and oceans, ignoring the trenches and political alliances of the era. Historical records indicate that by the time the epidemic reached its peak, it had swept the globe, claiming the lives of over 1 million people and leaving millions more permanently altered. It became a shadow pandemic, moving with a silent velocity that overwhelmed clinics and terrified populations already battered by global conflict. The clinical manifestations of the sleeping sickness were bewilderingly diverse, frustrating early attempts at medical categorization. While the classic presentation involved deep stupor and paralysis of the eye muscles, other patients experienced the exact opposite extreme. They suffered from frantic, involuntary movements known as hyperkinesia, severe insomnia, and acute psychosis. This erratic spectrum of symptoms suggested a pathogen that did not merely destroy brain tissue, but fundamentally disrupted the intricate, deeply buried control centers of human movement and wakefulness. Faced with a rapidly escalating global health crisis, the medical community mobilized to isolate the culprit, investigating the brains of those who succumbed to the illness. Autopsies consistently revealed targeted inflammation and microscopic lesions in the basal ganglia, the brain's central hub for motor control and subconscious movement. Yet, despite utilizing the most advanced microscopic techniques of the early 20th century and meticulously staining brain tissue, researchers could not identify a bacterium or virus. The infectious agent, if one existed, remained entirely invisible, leaving doctors to manage the devastating symptoms without understanding the underlying mechanism. A prevailing scientific theory quickly emerged connecting the outbreak to another catastrophic event, the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. The two plagues overlapped geographically and chronologically, leading many prominent scientists to suspect they were caused by the same pathogen, or that the flu somehow primed the human immune system for the sleeping sickness. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental, and this assumed correlation became deeply embedded in the medical literature of the time, shaping the direction of global research for years. However, rigorous epidemiological analysis soon began to fracture this assumed connection. The winter outbreaks of the sleeping sickness often peaked months before or after the local influenza waves hit specific cities. Furthermore, researchers attempting to transmit the disease to animals using brain tissue from victims failed to replicate the flu virus, or indeed, any transmissible pathogen. The conflicting data pointed toward a distinct independent entity, forcing investigators to look beyond the shadow of the influenza pandemic and confront a uniquely terrifying neurological puzzle that refused to fit into known epidemiological models. Then, in 1927, just as mysteriously as it had blanketed the globe, the epidemic vanished. The sudden cessation of new cases was as baffling as the initial outbreak itself. There was no vaccine developed, no widespread public health intervention, and no newly discovered treatment that could claim credit for halting the spread. The invisible pathogen simply retreated into the shadows of medical history, leaving behind a profound silence and a generation of survivors forever marked by its devastating passage. For those who survived the acute phase of the illness, the nightmare was far from over. Years, sometimes decades later, a terrifying secondary phase emerged, known as post-encephalitic syndrome. Thousands of patients gradually developed severe Parkinsonian symptoms, their bodies stiffening into rigid, statuesque poses. They experienced oculogeric crises, where their eyes would involuntarily roll upward and lock in place for hours. These survivors were heavily institutionalized, largely forgotten by a world eager to move past the traumas of the early 20th century, left to languish in a state of suspended animation. It was in the late 1960s at Mount Carmel Hospital in New York that the British neurologist Dr. Oliver Sacks encountered these forgotten survivors. He found wards filled with patients who had been frozen in time for 40 years, incapable of initiating movement or speech, yet possessing fully intact minds trapped within their rigid shells. The profound tragedy of their condition challenged the very boundaries of neurological science, presenting a living museum of a medical disaster that had long since faded from public memory. Driven by an intuitive understanding that the patient's core consciousness remained untouched, Dr. Oliver Sacks initiated an experimental treatment using a newly developed drug called L-DOPA. This chemical was a direct precursor to dopamine, the vital neurotransmitter severely depleted in the damaged basal ganglia of these post-encephalitic patients. The administration of this synthetic compound was a calculated risk, a desperate attempt to chemically bridge the damaged neural pathways that had kept these individuals locked away in silence for decades. The results of this chemical intervention were nothing short of miraculous. In the summer of 1969, the frozen wards awoke. Patients who had not spoken or moved independently since the 1920s suddenly stood up, danced, and conversed with startling clarity and emotional depth. This dramatic awakening provided undeniable proof that the self, the essential human personality, could survive decades of profound neurological suppression. It fundamentally shifted our understanding of brain chemistry, demonstrating the absolute necessity of dopamine for translating human intention into physical action. While the awakenings were tragically short-lived, with patients eventually developing severe side effects and returning to their frozen states, the lasting impact of this intervention continued to haunt modern medicine. The fundamental question remained unanswered regarding the true origins of the initial epidemic. Contemporary researchers, armed with genomic tools and molecular sequencing unimaginable to early 20th century doctors, began to re-examine archived brain tissues from the 1920s, searching for genetic fragments of the elusive pathogen. Modern analysis, utilizing polymerase chain reaction techniques, repeatedly failed to find viral RNA in the preserved brains, leading to a massive paradigm shift in the investigation. The prevailing theory moved away from a direct viral infection of the brain toward a devastating autoimmune response. Scientists hypothesized that a common, perhaps relatively mild infection triggered the immune system to produce antibodies. Through a biological error known as molecular mimicry, these antibodies mistakenly identified the neurons of the basal ganglia as foreign invaders attacking the host's own brain. This autoimmune theory is heavily supported by the discovery of specific autoantibodies in the spinal fluid of rare modern patients exhibiting symptoms strikingly similar to the historic sleeping sickness. Often these contemporary cases follow a routine streptococcal infection. The immune system, in its aggressive attempt to clear a simple throat infection, crosses the blood-brain barrier and attacks the very architecture of movement and wakefulness, mirroring the catastrophic neurological damage seen a century ago. Yet, the puzzle of the original outbreak is not fully solved. If the disease is an autoimmune reaction to a common pathogen like streptococcus, why did it manifest as a massive, synchronized global epidemic only once, between 1916 and 1927? The specific environmental, genetic, or viral combination that ignited the historical outbreak remains a heavily guarded secret of the natural world. Sporadic modern cases continue to appear, serving as quiet warnings that the precise conditions for another outbreak might one day align again, triggering a new wave of neurological stasis. The story of the sleeping sickness epidemic remains a testament to the fragility of human biology and the relentless pursuit of scientific truth. From the frozen wards of the 20th century to the molecular sequencing of the 21st, the investigation into this medical mystery has profoundly expanded our comprehension of the human brain. It stands as a humbling reminder that beneath the surface of our perceived medical mastery The natural world still harbors mysterious origins and phenomena capable of pausing human life, challenging us to remain ever vigilant and perpetually curious.